You think you know your children. You think after raising them, sacrificing for them, putting their needs before your own for decades, that they see you as more than just a convenient safety net. I thought that too. Until Black Friday 2024, when my 3 adult children left me stranded at North Shore Shopping Center, with nothing but my purse, and the crushing realization that I'd been nothing more than a free babysitter and ATM to them my entire life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But here's the thing about rock bottom. It gives you a solid foundation to build something new, and what I built? Well, let's just say it was a Black Friday they'd never forget. My name is Lucille Cox, though everyone's called me Lucy since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. At 62, I've got silver hair that I finally stopped dyeing brown last year, laugh lines that earn their place on my face, and hands that show every dish I've washed, every scraped knee I've bandaged, every late-night homework session I've supervised. I raised 3 children as a single mother, after their father decided that responsibility wasn't for him when our youngest was still in diapers. For 40 years, I worked double shifts as a nurse at Mercy General Hospital, coming home bone-tired only to start my second job as mom, chef, chauffeur, and cheerleader. I never remarried, never took that European vacation I dreamed about, never bought myself anything that wasn't practical and necessary. Every penny went to school clothes, college tuition, wedding expenses, and later, helping with grandchildren's needs. My eldest, Marcus, is 38 now and works in finance downtown. He's got that polished look that comes with success, drives a BMW, and lives in one of those modern condos with floor-to-ceiling windows. Then there's Rebecca, 35, a real estate agent who inherited my stubborn streak but used it to climb the ladder in her competitive field. She's married to David, a decent enough man who works in tech, and they've got 2 kids, Emma and Jake, my precious grandchildren aged 8 and 10. My baby Anthony turned 32 this year. He's the artist of the family, or at least that's what he calls himself. He works part-time at a coffee shop while pursuing his photography, still living in the apartment I help him pay rent for because art doesn't pay the bills, as he reminds me monthly when he calls asking for money. I thought we were close. I thought all those years of sacrifice had built something solid between us, a foundation of love and mutual respect. I thought wrong. The trouble started brewing weeks before Black Friday, though I didn't see it coming like the fool I apparently was. It began with what seemed like innocent conversations, casual mentions of holiday shopping plans and family gatherings. Marcus called first, his voice carrying that particular tone he used when he wanted something but was trying to sound casual about it. Mom, hey, quick question. You know how you always do that big Black Friday shopping trip? Well, Sarah and I were thinking, maybe this year you could handle getting gifts for the kids. We're just swamped with work, and you know how good you are at finding those perfect presents. Sarah was his girlfriend of 2 years, a perfectly nice woman who worked in marketing and had never shown much interest in getting to know me beyond polite small talk at family dinners. But Marcus seemed happy, and that's all I cared about. Of course, sweetheart, I'd said, already mentally calculating the budget I'd need. What were you thinking for Emma and Jake? And do Sarah's kids need anything special? Oh, just whatever you think is best. You're so much better at this stuff than we are. Maybe some toys, clothes, whatever kids need these days. We'll pay you back, obviously. Obviously. That should have been my first red flag. But I was too caught up in feeling needed, feeling useful, to notice the casual way he assumed I'd front the money for gifts that would have his and Sarah's names on them. Rebecca called the next day with a similar request, though hers came wrapped in more elaborate reasoning. Mom, I hate to ask, but you know how crazy the real estate market gets right before the holidays. I've got 3 closings scheduled for next week, and David's dealing with that big project launch. Could you possibly handle Christmas shopping for Emma and Jake this year? And maybe grab something nice for David's parents, too? They're flying in from Portland, and I want to make a good impression. What about your shopping for me and your brothers? I asked, trying to keep the question light. There was a pause that lasted just a beat too long. Oh, we'll figure something out. Don't worry about that. We're not really big on the gift-giving thing anymore. We're all adults. All adults. Funny how being adults meant they were too busy to shop for their mother, but not too busy to ask her to shop for everyone else. Anthony's call came last, and his was the most transparent of all. He didn't bother with elaborate explanations or work excuses. "Mom, I'm totally broke this year." Like, seriously strapped. "Could you cover Christmas for everyone? I'll pay you back when my art starts selling. I've got this gallery showing lined up, and once that takes off, I'll be able to contribute more to the family stuff." This gallery showing he'd been talking about for 3 years. The one that kept getting postponed or canceled or moved to a different venue that never quite materialized. But hope springs eternal in a mother's heart. And I wanted to believe in his dreams even when common sense whispered that I was enabling his irresponsibility. "How much are we talking about, honey?" I asked, though I already knew I'd say yes regardless of the number. "I don't know, just whatever feels right. You know what everyone likes. Maybe a couple $100 per person? Nothing crazy, just enough to make Christmas feel like Christmas. A couple $100 per person. For Marcus, Sarah, Rebecca, David, Emma, Jake, David's parents, and Anthony himself. Plus decorations, holiday dinner ingredients, and the gifts they'd ask me to buy for each other. I was looking at over $2,000, easily. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a calculator and my bank statement spread out in front of me, working through the numbers by the light of the lamp I'd owned since the kids were small. After 40 years of nursing, careful budgeting, and living modestly, I'd managed to save a decent amount for retirement. Not enough to live lavishly, but enough to feel secure. The Christmas shopping they'd requested would make a significant dent in those savings. But what mother doesn't want to give her children a beautiful holiday? I convinced myself it was an investment in family harmony, in keeping traditions alive, in showing my children that their happiness mattered more to me than money ever could. Looking back, I can see how naive that sounds, but at the time, it felt like love. The plan was simple, or so I thought. We'd all meet at North Shore Shopping Center at 6 a.m. on Black Friday, tackle the crowds together, divide up the shopping list, and reconvene for lunch before heading home with our haul. It would be fun, they said. A family adventure. Quality time together during the busiest shopping day of the year. I spent the week before making lists, clipping coupons, researching sales, and planning our route through the mall. I printed maps of the shopping center, highlighted the stores we'd need to visit, and even packed a small cooler with snacks and water bottles, because I knew the crowds would be intense and the day would be long. Thursday night, I barely slept. Not from excitement, though there was some of that, but from anxiety. Something felt off about the whole arrangement, though I couldn't put my finger on what exactly bothered me. Maybe it was the way Marcus had been vague about meeting times. Maybe it was how Rebecca kept changing the shopping list, adding more people who needed gifts. Maybe it was Anthony's assumption that I'd cover everything up front without any discussion of when or how he'd pay me back. But I pushed those worries aside and focused on the positive. My children wanted to spend Black Friday with me. They trusted me to help make their holiday shopping successful. They needed me. I should have listened to my instincts. Friday morning arrived cold and gray, with the kind of November wind that cuts right through your coat and makes your bones ache. I was dressed and ready by 4:30, even though we weren't supposed to meet until 6. I made coffee, checked my shopping lists one more time, and loaded my purse with credit cards, cash, and the detailed notes I'd made about everyone's gift preferences. The parking lot at North Shore Shopping Center was already half full when I arrived at 5:45, cars circling like sharks looking for spots close to the entrances. I found a space near the food court entrance and sat in my car with the heater running, watching for my children's vehicles and checking my phone for any last-minute updates. At 6:15, Marcus texted, "Running late. Traffic crazy. Start without us. We'll catch up." Rebecca's message came at 6:20. "Kids had meltdown this morning, dealing with tantrum. Go ahead and get started. We'll find you." Anthony called at 6:30, his voice thick with sleep. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I think I'm coming down with something. Might not make it today. Can you handle my shopping? I'll Venmo you back." Standing there in the parking lot, clutching my phone and feeling the first sharp edges of realization cutting through my maternal optimism, I knew. They weren't coming. they'd never planned to come. This whole elaborate Black Friday family shopping trip was just a way to get me to do their work for them, while they slept in or dealt with their own priorities. But I was already there, already committed, and the stubborn part of me that had gotten me through 40 years of single motherhood wasn't about to waste the trip. I'd do their shopping, I decided. I'd be the good mother, the reliable one, the woman who never let her family down even when they let her down. The mall was chaos in the way that only Black Friday can achieve. Crowds pressed against store gates waiting for openings. Long lines snaked around corners, and the air buzzed with that particular energy of people determined to get deals at any cost. I joined the throngs, shopping list in hand, credit card ready. For 6 hours, I battled through crowds, waited in lines, and collected gifts for people who couldn't be bothered to show up. I bought video games for Jake, art supplies for Emma, a cashmere scarf for David's mother, expensive cologne for David, a leather briefcase for Marcus, jewelry for Sarah, a professional camera lens for Anthony that cost more than I spent on myself in 6 months, and a designer purse for Rebecca that she'd mentioned wanting back in September. My feet ached in my sensible shoes. My back throbbed from carrying heavy shopping bags. My wallet grew lighter with each purchase. But I kept going, driven by that maternal instinct that says a good mother sacrifices her comfort for her children's happiness. It was around noon when I realized I needed help getting everything to my car. The bags were numerous and heavy, and my 62-year-old body was reminding me that I wasn't 20 anymore. I called Marcus first. "Hey, sweetheart, I'm finishing up the shopping. Could you swing by and help me carry everything to the car?" "Oh man, Mom, I'm actually in the middle of something right now. Can't you just make a couple trips? Or maybe ask mall security to help?" Mall security. For the shopping I was doing for his Christmas gifts, Rebecca's phone went straight to voicemail. Anthony didn't answer either. I tried Rebecca again, and this time she picked up. "Mom, what's up? Make it quick. We're at David's parents' house for lunch." David's parents' house. The same parents I'd just bought expensive gifts for, paid for with money I'd earned through decades of double shifts and careful saving. I need help carrying the shopping bags to my car. There are quite a few, and they're heavy. Can't you just figure it out? We're kind of in the middle of family time here.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Maybe get a cart or something? Family time. I was apparently not included in that definition, despite being the one who'd spent the morning and several $100s ensuring their family time would include beautifully wrapped presents under the tree. That's when it hit me, standing there in the busy corridor of North Shore Shopping Center, surrounded by shopping bags full of gifts for people who couldn't spare 30 minutes to help their mother carry them to her car. I wasn't family to them, I was staff. I was the person who handled the inconvenient tasks, who solved the problems, who made sure everything ran smoothly so they could enjoy their lives without interruption. I was 62 years old, tired, sore, and carrying thousands of dollars worth of gifts for people who saw me as nothing more than a convenient solution to their holiday shopping problem. They'd orchestrated this entire day to get out of doing their own shopping while making me feel like I was participating in some kind of family tradition. As I stood there, watching families laughing together as they navigated the crowds, parents and children working as teams to find the perfect gifts, I felt more alone than I had since my husband walked out 40 years ago. At least then, I'd had 3 small children who needed me, who depended on me, who loved me without condition. Now I had 3 adults who used me without conscience. The realization settled over me like a heavy blanket, warm with anger, but cold with hurt. This wasn't the first time, I realized. This was just the most obvious example of a pattern that had been building for years. How many times had Marcus called asking me to babysit Sarah's kids while he and Sarah went out, never offering to pay for my time or even bring dinner? How many times had Rebecca asked me to pick up Emma and Jake from school or activities because something came up at work, treating me like a free childcare service? How many times had Anthony borrowed money that he never paid back, asked me to co-sign loans, or simply assumed I'd cover his expenses when his artistic pursuits didn't generate income? I'd enabled this behavior, I realized. I'd said yes so many times, been so eager to be needed and included, that I'd trained my own children to see me as a resource rather than a person. Standing in that crowded mall, surrounded by evidence of my children's selfishness and my own willingness to be used, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to continue this pattern. I wasn't going to keep subsidizing their lives while they treated mine as inconsequential. But first, I had to get these damn bags to my car. I found a mall cart and loaded everything into it, my movements deliberate and my mind racing with possibilities. For the first time in years, maybe decades, I was thinking about what I wanted instead of what everyone else needed from me. The feeling was both terrifying and exhilarating. As I pushed that cart through the parking lot, my phone buzzed with texts from all three of my children. Messages that a few hours earlier would have felt like thoughtful check-ins, but now read like inventory updates from people tracking a delivery. Marcus, how's the shopping going? Get everything on the list. Rebecca, thanks for handling everything today. You're the best. Can't wait to see what you found. Anthony, feeling better now. Wish I could have made it. You're amazing for covering for me. Amazing for covering for him. The best for handling everything. I was being thanked for doing their work, praised for making their lives easier, appreciated for my utility. I loaded the shopping bags into my trunk, returned the cart, and sat in my car for a long moment before starting the engine. My reflection in the rearview mirror showed a woman I barely recognized. Tired, yes. Hurt, absolutely. But there was something else there too, something I hadn't seen in my own face for a very long time. Determination. The drive home gave me time to think, and by the time I pulled into my driveway, I had the beginnings of a plan. Not a revenge fantasy, nothing cruel or destructive, but a lesson in consequences that was long overdue. I carried the shopping bags into my house and spread everything out on my dining room table, arranging the gifts like evidence in a case I was building against my own enabling behavior. Hundreds of dollars worth of thoughtful presents, chosen with care for people who hadn't cared enough to spend a single hour helping me shop for them. That night, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to my financial advisor, David Kim, a patient man who'd been helping me manage my retirement savings for the past decade. David, I need to make some changes to my accounts. I want to set up automatic transfers that will move the majority of my savings into investments that I can't easily access. And I want to remove my children as beneficiaries on my checking account. Mrs. Cox, that's quite a significant change. May I ask what's prompting this decision? I've realized I've been too generous for my own good. It's time I started prioritizing my financial security instead of everyone else's convenience. The second call was to my lawyer, Patricia Stone, a sharp woman in her 50s, who'd handled my will and power of attorney documents years earlier. Patricia, I need to schedule an appointment to revise my will. Completely. I want to explore options for charitable giving and educational trusts instead of direct inheritance. That's certainly possible, Lucille. Should I ask what's brought about this change in your estate planning? Let's just say I've had a revelation about the difference between being loved and being used. The third call was to my sister Margaret, who lived 3 states away but had always been my closest confidant. Maggie, how would you feel about a house guest for Christmas? I'm thinking it might be time for a change of scenery. Lucy, what's happened? You sound different. I spent Black Friday getting a very expensive education about my place in my children's lives. I think it's time I started living for myself instead of for them. It's about damn time, Margaret said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. I've been waiting years for you to figure that out. How long can you stay? How about we start with a month and see how it goes? After those calls, I poured myself a glass of wine, something I rarely did on weeknights, and sat in my living room looking at the photos that covered every surface. 40 years of birthdays, graduations, holidays, and milestones. 40 years of putting everyone else first, of measuring my worth by how much I could give and how little I needed in return. Tomorrow, I decided, would be the first day of the rest of my life. A life where Lucille Cox mattered just as much as the people she'd spent decades taking care of. And Black Friday? Well, that was just the beginning of a very expensive lesson my children were about to learn about taking their mother for granted. I fell asleep that night with a smile on my face, dreaming not of the grateful faces of my children opening their Christmas presents, but of white sand beaches and European cafes, art classes and book clubs, and all the things I'd never allowed myself to want because wanting felt selfish when others needed. Selfish. Such an interesting word. I was about to find out what it really meant to be selfish, and I had a feeling I was going to like it very much indeed. The next morning arrived with the kind of clarity that only comes after a storm has passed through your life and rearranged everything you thought you knew about yourself. I woke up naturally at 6:30, without an alarm, without the usual anxiety about what everyone else needed from me that day. For the first time in decades, my morning belonged entirely to me. I made coffee in my favorite mug, the one with the chip on the handle that I'd never replaced because it reminded me of Emma's first attempt at making me breakfast in bed when she was 6. Now, looking at that chip, I wondered why I'd held onto reminders of moments when my grandchildren had shown me more consideration than their parents ever did. My phone had been buzzing since 7 with messages from all 3 children, but I ignored it while I sat at my kitchen table planning what would become the most liberating month of my life. The Christmas presents from yesterday's shopping expedition were still spread across my dining room table like artifacts from a previous existence, and seeing them in the morning light only reinforced my resolve. When I finally checked my messages, the pattern was exactly what I'd expected. Marcus had sent 3 texts asking when I'd be dropping off his portion of the gifts, and whether I'd gotten the receipt for the briefcase, because Sarah wanted to make sure it came with a warranty. Rebecca had left a voicemail wondering if I could wrap everything before delivering it, because she didn't have time to make the packages look nice. Anthony had texted asking if I could bring his gifts to his apartment, because his car was making a weird noise and he didn't want to risk driving it. Not one of them had asked how I was feeling after yesterday. Not one had thanked me for shouldering their responsibilities. Not one had offered to reimburse me for the thousands of dollars I'd spent on their behalf. Instead of responding to their messages, I called David Kim back. Professional and discreet as always, he confirmed that the financial restructuring I'd requested was already in motion. My savings would be moved into accounts that required 30-day notice for withdrawals, effectively preventing me from making any more impulsive financial decisions on behalf of ungrateful children. The sense of relief that washed over me was immediate and profound. Patricia Stone was equally efficient. She'd cleared her afternoon schedule to meet with me about revising my will, and she'd already prepared some preliminary documents based on our conversation. The idea of leaving my life savings to organizations that actually helped people instead of enabling entitled adults felt revolutionary. Margaret called while I was getting dressed, her voice bright with excitement. "Lucy, I've been thinking about your visit all night. There's this wonderful art colony about an hour from here that offers month-long retreats for people over 50. Painting, pottery, creative writing, whatever speaks to you. What do you think?" An art colony. The very idea would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. I was Lucille Cox, the practical one, the caregiver, the woman who put everyone else's dreams before her own. But standing in my bedroom, looking at the sensible clothes I'd worn for decades because they were suitable for cleaning house and chasing grandchildren, I felt something shift inside me. "Tell me more," I said, and the words felt like the first honest thing I'd said to myself in years. By noon, I'd made more decisions about my own life than I had in the previous decade. I would spend Christmas with Margaret. I would enroll in the art retreat she'd described. I would stop answering my children's calls immediately and let them wonder why their personal assistant had suddenly become unavailable. But first, I needed to address the elephant in my dining room. I carefully repacked all the Christmas gifts I'd bought, organized them by recipient, and loaded them back into my car. Then I drove to the post office and shipped every single item back to the stores where I'd purchased them, using the gift receipts I'd meticulously saved. The return policies were generous, and within 2 hours, I had refund confirmations totaling over $1,800. The feeling of taking that money back, of undoing my children's assumptions about my willingness to finance their convenience, was intoxicating. Each return felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that I'd given away too freely for too long. My phone rang constantly during this process. Marcus called 4 times. Rebecca left increasingly agitated voicemails. Anthony sent a series of texts that progressed from casual inquiry to genuine confusion about why I wasn't responding. I turned the phone off. That afternoon, I drove to the travel agency downtown, a quaint little office run by Helen Morrison, a woman about my age who'd helped me book the occasional weekend trip to visit Margaret over the years. Helen took one look at my face and smiled knowingly. Lucille Cox, you look like a woman with plans. What can I do for you today? Helen, I want to book a trip. Somewhere I've never been. Somewhere that doesn't remind me of anyone else's needs or expectations. What would you recommend for a woman who's just discovered she has her own life to live? Helen's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of someone who'd spent decades helping people escape their ordinary lives. How do you feel about Italy? There's a wonderful tour that combines art history with cooking classes, small groups, lots of flexibility. Or maybe Ireland. Beautiful countryside, rich culture, perfect for someone looking to reconnect with herself. Italy. I dreamed of seeing the art in Florence, of standing in the Sistine Chapel, of eating real pasta in a tiny Roman trattoria. Dreams I'd pushed aside every time one of my children needed something, every time my own desires seemed selfish compared to their immediate needs. Tell me about Italy, I said, and Helen's smile grew wider. 2 hours later, I walked out of that travel agency with confirmed reservations for a 3-week Italian art and culture tour, departing in January, just after I returned from my visit with Margaret. The cost was substantial, but it was my money, earned through my work, saved through my careful budgeting. For the first time in my adult life, I was spending a significant amount on something that was purely for my own enjoyment. The guilt that tried to creep in as I drove home was met with a fierce new voice in my head, one that sounded suspiciously like Margaret. Lucille Cox, it said, you've earned this 10 times over. Stop apologizing for wanting something beautiful for yourself. When I got home, my landline was blinking with 12 new messages. I didn't listen to any of them. Instead, I made myself a proper dinner. Something more elaborate than the simple meals I usually prepared just for myself. I opened a bottle of wine I'd been saving for a special occasion, and I decided that discovering my own worth qualified as special enough. As I cooked, I thought about the art retreat Margaret had described. When was the last time I'd created something, just for the joy of creating it? In nursing school, I'd loved my art classes, had even considered majoring in fine arts before practical concerns about supporting myself led me toward healthcare. What would it feel like to hold a paintbrush again, to lose myself in color and texture without worrying about whether anyone else would approve of the result? The next morning brought a new wave of messages from my children, but their tone had shifted. The casual expectation had been replaced by confusion and growing irritation. Marcus had driven to my house the evening before and was baffled to find my car gone and my lights out. Rebecca was demanding to know where I was and why I wasn't returning her calls. Anthony had enlisted his girlfriend to call me, as if I might answer for a stranger when I wouldn't answer for him. I made coffee, checked my email, and found confirmation of my Italian tour booking along with a detailed itinerary that made my heart race with anticipation. Florence, Rome, Venice, small hill towns whose names I could barely pronounce but whose photos looked like something from a fairy tale. 3 weeks of museums and cooking classes, of guided tours and free time to explore, of conversations with fellow travelers who didn't know me as anyone's mother or grandmother but simply as Lucy, a woman curious about the world. The phone rang at 8:30. Marcus, based on the caller ID. I let it go to voicemail and heard his voice, sharp with frustration. Mom, this is ridiculous. We need to talk about Christmas shopping. Call me back immediately. Immediately. As if I were his employee who'd failed to complete an assigned task. Rebecca called 10 minutes later. Her message was longer and more manipulative. Mom, I'm really worried about you. This isn't like you to just disappear without telling anyone where you are. Emma and Jake keep asking when Grandma Lucy is coming to see them, and I don't know what to tell them. Please call me back so we know you're okay. Using my grandchildren as emotional leverage. A new low, even for Rebecca. Anthony's approach was different, hurt and confused rather than demanding. Mom, I don't understand what's happening. Did I do something wrong? Are you mad about yesterday? I was really sick, I swear. Please just call me back. I'm worried about you. Worried about me. If he'd been genuinely worried, he might have shown up yesterday despite feeling under the weather. He might have offered to help carry bags, or suggested we reschedule. Instead, he'd seen my willingness to handle his responsibilities as a convenient solution to his problems. At 10 o'clock, my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I could see Marcus standing on my front porch, dressed in his expensive wool coat and looking like a man unaccustomed to being ignored. I considered not answering, but decided it was time to begin the education process. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. "Good morning, Marcus." "Mom, what the hell is going on? You've been ignoring our calls, and Rebecca said you haven't responded to any of her messages either. We were supposed to coordinate the Christmas gift situation, remember? I remember you asking me to handle your Christmas shopping because you were too busy. I remember doing exactly that. What I don't remember is agreeing to be available for immediate consultation whenever it's convenient for you." Marcus blinked, clearly taken aback by my directness. "Okay, but where are the gifts? I need to pick up the stuff for Sarah and her kids." "What gifts would those be?" "The ones you bought yesterday. The Christmas shopping we talked about." "The Christmas shopping you didn't show up for, you mean? The shopping I did alone while you slept in and Rebecca enjoyed family time with David's parents?" His face reddened slightly. "Mom, I explained about the traffic. And Rebecca had a situation with the kids. We couldn't help it. Marcus, I'm 62 years old. I've raised 3 children, worked 40 years as a nurse, and survived more genuine emergencies than you've probably encountered in your entire life. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending that 3 healthy adults with working vehicles couldn't manage to show up at a predetermined location if they'd actually wanted to be there." He shifted uncomfortably, and I realized this might be the first time in years I'd spoken to any of my children without cushioning my words to protect their feelings. "Look, whatever, we can talk about that later. Right now, I just need to get the gifts so Sarah and I can wrap them tonight." "There are no gifts, Marcus." "What do you mean there are no gifts? You spent all day shopping yesterday." "I spent all day shopping, yes. And then I spent yesterday afternoon returning everything to the stores where I bought it. Every single item." The silence that followed was profound. Marcus stared at me as if I'd announced I was joining a cult or moving to Mars. "You returned everything? Why would you do that?" "Because I realized I was subsidizing your laziness and enabling your assumption that my time, money, and effort are free resources for you to exploit whenever it's convenient." "Mom, that's not... We don't think of you that way." "Really? When was the last time you invited me to spend time with you that didn't involve me providing some kind of service? When was the last time you called just to see how I was doing, not because you needed something? When was the last time you offered to help me with anything?" Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it again. I could see him searching his memory and coming up empty. "We're family," he said finally. "Family helps each other." "You're absolutely right. Family does help each other. Which is why I'm helping you learn how to handle your own responsibilities instead of depending on me to solve all your problems." "This is crazy, Mom. It's Christmas. You can't just decide not to participate in Christmas." "I'm not deciding not to participate in Christmas. I'm deciding not to finance and orchestrate everyone else's Christmas while they treat me like unpaid staff." Marcus ran his hand through his hair, a gesture I remembered from his childhood when he was frustrated about not getting his way. "What are we supposed to do about gifts now? Christmas is in 3 weeks. The same thing millions of other adults do, Marcus. Go shopping, make decisions, spend your own money, handle your own responsibilities. But we don't have time. We're busy with work and I'm busy with my own life." "Novel concept, I know." He stared at me for another long moment, then shook his head. "I don't understand what's gotten into you, but this isn't you, Mom. This isn't how you act. You're right. The woman who spent yesterday shopping for people too selfish to help her carry the bags afterward isn't who I want to be anymore. This is who I'm choosing to become." Marcus left without another word, and I watched him drive away with a mixture of sadness and liberation. Sadness for the relationship we might have had, if he'd ever seen me as a person worth knowing instead of a problem-solving service. Liberation, because I'd finally said out loud what I'd been thinking for years. The next few hours brought a flurry of activity as news of my conversation with Marcus spread to his siblings. Rebecca called 6 times in rapid succession. When I finally answered on the 7th call, her voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "Mom, Marcus told me about your conversation this morning. I think you're being completely unreasonable. Unreasonable how, exactly? You promised to handle Christmas shopping for everyone, and now you're backing out at the last minute. Do you have any idea how that affects our plans? Rebecca, I didn't promise anything. You asked me to do your shopping because you were too busy with work. I agreed because I wanted to help. But when I needed help carrying the bags to my car, where were you? Having lunch with David's family. That wasn't planned. David's parents surprised us with the invitation. And you couldn't have called to let me know? Couldn't have suggested we reschedule? Couldn't have asked David to pick me up on the way so I could join the family lunch? Another silence. I was learning that my children had no response when confronted with their own thoughtlessness. Besides, I continued, I never agreed to pay for everyone's gifts. That was an assumption you all made without discussing it with me. We always pay you back. When, Rebecca? When have any of you ever paid me back for anything? When did Marcus repay me for the down payment I gave him for his car? When did Anthony return the money I lent him for his photography equipment? When did you reimburse me for the dress I bought for Emma's school play? Or the birthday party I threw for Jake? Those were gifts. Family doesn't keep score like that. You're right, family doesn't keep score. But family also doesn't take advantage of each other's generosity. Family shows up when they say they will. Family expresses gratitude. Family treats each other with respect. I can't believe you're being this petty over Christmas shopping. And I can't believe my own daughter thinks it's petty for me to expect basic consideration from my children. Rebecca hung up on me. Anthony's reaction was different, but equally revealing. He showed up at my house that evening, not demanding or angry like Marcus, but hurt and confused in the way he'd perfected as a child when he wanted to avoid consequences for his actions. Mom, I don't understand why you're mad at us. We love you. You know that, right? I invited him in because his approach was gentler, and because part of me still held hope that my youngest might be capable of growth in ways his siblings weren't. Anthony, sit down. Tell me what you think happened yesterday. You went shopping for Christmas while we dealt with other stuff. That's what we always do. What we always do. Tell me about this pattern you see where I do the work and you deal with other stuff. He looked genuinely puzzled. I don't know what you mean. You like shopping. You're good at picking out gifts. We're not. I like shopping for myself occasionally. I'm good at picking out gifts because I pay attention to what people want and need. And you're not good at it because you've never tried. But you always handle Christmas. And birthdays. And Easter. You like doing that stuff. Anthony, have I ever told you I like doing that stuff? Or have you assumed I like it because I've never complained about it? He thought about that for a moment, and I could see the wheels turning in his head. I guess I just thought, since you always did it. Let me ask you something else. In the past year, how many times have you called me just to chat? Not because you needed money or help with something, but just because you wanted to talk to your mother. Another long pause. I don't know. I call you. You call when you need something. You called last month because your rent was due, and you were short. You called in September because you wanted me to co-sign a loan for new camera equipment. You called in July because you needed someone to watch your neighbor's cat while you went to a music festival. When did you last call just to see how I was doing? The hurt on his face was genuine, and for a moment I felt the familiar urge to comfort him, to take back my words and pretend everything was fine. But that urge was exactly what had gotten me into this situation. I didn't realize, he said quietly. I know you didn't. And that's the problem, Anthony. None of you realize that I'm a person with my own feelings and needs. You see me as a function, not a human being. That's not true. We love you. Do you love me? Or do you love what I do for you? He couldn't answer that question, and his inability to respond was answer enough. After Anthony left, I sat in my quiet house and felt the full weight of what I was doing. I was dismantling 40 years of family dynamics, challenging relationships that had defined my entire adult life. It was terrifying and necessary and long overdue. That night, I called Margaret to tell her about my conversations with the children. How do you feel? She asked. Honest, I said. For the first time in decades, I feel completely honest. And how are they taking it? About as well as you'd expect from people who've never been held accountable for their selfishness. Margaret laughed. Good for you, Lucy. What's next? Next, I start living like I matter as much as everyone else. The following week was a revelation in solitude and self-discovery. Without the constant interruptions of my children's needs and demands, I had time to remember who I was before I became a mother. I rediscovered my love of reading, spending entire afternoons curled up with novels I'd been meaning to read for years. I took long walks through my neighborhood, noticing details I'd missed in 40 years of hurried trips to handle someone else's emergency. I cleaned out closets and drawers, getting rid of clothes I'd kept because they were practical, and replacing them with items that made me feel attractive and confident. I went to the library and checked out books on art and travel, planning my Italian adventure with the enthusiasm of a teenager. My children continued to call, but their messages grew increasingly desperate and manipulative. Marcus left voicemails alternating between anger and attempts at guilt. Rebecca tried enlisting Emma and Jake to call me, coaching them to ask when Grandma Lucy would come visit them soon. Anthony showed up at my door twice more, each time looking more confused about why his usual blend of charm and vulnerability wasn't working. I didn't respond to any of them. 2 weeks before Christmas, I received a group text message that they'd apparently coordinated. Mom, we need to talk. Family meeting at Rebecca's house Sunday at 2 p.m. This has gone on long enough. I stared at that message for a long time, seeing it for what it was. Not an invitation, but a summons. Not a request for my time, but a demand for my compliance. They thought they could call a meeting, and I would show up like an obedient employee, ready to be lectured about my recent poor performance. I typed back a single response. I'll be traveling. Have a lovely meeting. It wasn't technically a lie. I was traveling to the bookstore, then to the art supply store to buy materials for Margaret's retreat recommendation. Sunday afternoon came and went. I spent it painting watercolors at my kitchen table, losing myself in the simple pleasure of watching colors blend and flow on paper. I was terrible at it, but that didn't matter. For the first time in my adult life, I was doing something purely for the joy of doing it, without worrying about whether the result would please anyone else. My phone buzzed with messages throughout the afternoon. They'd held their meeting without me, apparently deciding that I was having some kind of breakdown and needed intervention. Marcus threatened to call my doctor if I didn't start behaving normally. Rebecca suggested I might need counseling to work through whatever issues were causing me to act so selfishly. Anthony sent a long, rambling text about how much they all loved me and how worried they were about my mental state. Mental state. Because clearly, any woman who stopped enabling her adult children's selfishness must be mentally unstable. That evening, I made my final decision about Christmas. I called each of them and left identical voicemails. I will not be participating in Christmas celebrations this year. I'll be traveling to visit family who actually appreciate my company. I hope you all have a wonderful holiday learning to handle your own responsibilities. Then I packed my bags for Margaret's house and started the most liberating road trip of my life. The drive to Margaret's took me through small towns and countryside I'd never bothered to notice before, always too focused on getting to my destination quickly so I could get back to whatever crisis needed my attention at home. This time, I stopped whenever something caught my eye. I had lunch at a little cafe in a town I'd never heard of, chatting with the owner about her recipes. I visited a pottery studio and watched artists work at their wheels, remembering my brief attempt at ceramics in college. By the time I reached Margaret's house, I felt like I'd been traveling for months instead of hours. The woman who pulled into her driveway was not the same woman who'd been abandoned at North Shore Shopping Center 3 weeks earlier. Margaret took one look at my face and grinned. "Lucille Cox, you look like trouble." "I certainly hope so," I said, and meant every word. Margaret's house was everything mine wasn't. Where my home had been carefully organized around other people's comfort and needs, hers was unapologetically personal. Books stacked everywhere. Not because she was messy, but because she was always in the middle of reading 3 different novels. Art supplies scattered across her dining room table from whatever project had captured her attention that week. Plants thriving in every window because she talked to them like old friends. "Welcome to chaos," she said, leading me through rooms that felt alive with creativity and purpose. I cleared out the guest room, but fair warning, You might find paintbrushes in the bathroom and half-finished pottery in the kitchen. I get inspired at odd hours. I set my bags down in the sunny guest room and felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't even realized was tight. The bed was covered with a quilt Margaret had made herself, imperfect stitches that somehow made it more beautiful than any store-bought bedding. The walls were covered with photographs from her travels, paintings she'd created during various art classes, and sketches of interesting faces she'd encountered over the years. "Maggie, this is incredible. When did you become so artistic?" She laughed, settling into the armchair by the window. "Lucy, I've always been artistic. You just never had time to notice because you were too busy raising everyone else's children and managing everyone else's lives." That stung because it was true. In all our phone conversations over the years, Margaret had mentioned taking painting classes, joining a pottery studio, even selling some of her work at local craft fairs. But I'd always been distracted by whatever crisis needed my immediate attention, half listening while mentally planning solutions to problems that weren't even my own. "Tell me about the art retreat," I said, sitting on the edge of the bed and really looking at my sister for the first time in years. At 64, Margaret had the kind of confidence I was just beginning to discover. Her silver hair was cut in a modern style that framed her face beautifully, and she wore clothes that were both comfortable and stylish, nothing like the purely functional wardrobe I'd maintained for decades. It's called Sunrise Studios, about an hour north of here in the mountains. They offer month-long intensives for people who want to explore their creativity without judgment or pressure. Painting, pottery, jewelry making, creative writing, even some fiber arts. The woman who runs it, Diana Chen, is a former art professor who got tired of academic constraints and decided to create a space where people could just play and discover what spoke to them. "Play," I repeated, testing the word. When was the last time I'd done anything that could be called play? The best part is that everyone there is on their own journey. No one cares if you've never held a paintbrush or if you're starting over at 60. Diana says some of her most fearless students are women our age who finally decided to stop apologizing for taking up space in the world. That night, over dinner at Margaret's kitchen table, I told her everything. The years of enabling, the financial manipulation, the way my children had turned me into their personal assistant without ever acknowledging what they were taking from me. I told her about the lawyer, the financial restructuring, the Italian trip I'd booked in a moment of rebellious clarity. "Good for you," Margaret said when I finished. "I've been waiting 20 years for you to get mad enough to change things." "You never said anything. Would you have listened?" "Lucy, I love you, but you were so invested in being the perfect martyr mother that any criticism of your children felt like a personal attack to you. Remember when Anthony was 25 and still asking you to pay his car insurance? I suggested he might need to learn some responsibility, and you didn't speak to me for 3 months. I did remember that. I'd been furious with Margaret for not understanding how hard Anthony was trying, how much he needed my support while he figured out his artistic career. Looking back, I could see how defensive I'd been about any suggestion that my children were taking advantage of my generosity. "I was enabling all of us," I said slowly. "I was enabling their selfishness and my own need to feel needed." Bingo. But Lucy, recognizing the pattern is only the first step. Now comes the hard part. Which is sticking to your boundaries when they escalate their tactics. And honey, they will escalate. Right now they're confused and annoyed, but when they realize you're serious about changing the dynamic, they're going to pull out every manipulation they've ever learned. As if summoned by our conversation, my phone began buzzing on the counter. Marcus, calling for the 4th time that day. Margaret and I looked at each other, and she raised an eyebrow. "Want to practice ignoring them?" I turned the phone face down and poured myself another glass of wine. "I think I'm getting the hang of it." The next morning, Margaret introduced me to her routine. Coffee on the back porch while watching the sunrise, a practice she'd maintained for 15 years. No phone, no television, no distractions from the simple pleasure of being present in the moment. "I started doing this after my divorce," she explained, handing me a steaming mug. "I realized I'd spent so many years rushing through mornings, always focused on what needed to be done that day, that I'd forgotten how beautiful the world could be when you slowed down enough to notice it. We sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky change colors over the mountains in the distance. I couldn't remember the last time I'd watched a sunrise without simultaneously planning the day's tasks or worrying about someone else's problems. Margaret, can I ask you something? Do you ever feel guilty about living for yourself? She considered the question seriously. In the beginning, yes. I felt selfish for wanting time alone, guilty for spending money on art supplies instead of gifts for other people, ashamed for prioritizing my own happiness. But you know what I learned? What? Guilt is often just the feeling we get when we stop doing something that wasn't actually our responsibility in the first place. That phrase hit me like a physical blow. Guilt is the feeling we get when we stop doing something that wasn't our responsibility. How much of my life had I spent feeling guilty for not doing enough, not giving enough, not being available enough for people who'd never once asked if their demands were reasonable? My phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Rebecca. Mom, this is getting ridiculous. Emma keeps asking where you are and I don't know what to tell her. You're being selfish and hurting your grandchildren. I showed the message to Margaret, who snorted. Classic manipulation. When all else fails, use the grandchildren as weapons. But what if she's right? What if Emma and Jake are confused about why I'm not around? Lucy, how often did Emma and Jake actually see you before this? Were you a regular part of their daily lives? Or were you just the emergency babysitter who showed up when their parents needed something? I thought about it honestly. Emma and Jake were wonderful children who I loved deeply, but Rebecca had never included me in their regular routines. I saw them when she needed a sitter, when she wanted someone to pick them up from school, when she had work conflicts that required childcare. Our relationship was loving but sporadic, entirely dependent on their mother's convenience. She's using them, I said quietly. She is. And the fact that she's willing to confuse and upset her own children to manipulate you tells you everything you need to know about her priorities. The messages continued throughout the day, growing increasingly desperate and manipulative. Marcus sent a long email detailing all the ways my behavior was affecting the family, including Sarah's disappointment about Christmas plans and her children's confusion about why Grandma Lucy had disappeared. Anthony called repeatedly, leaving voicemails that ranged from hurt confusion to barely veiled anger about my selfishness. But it was Rebecca's final message of the day that showed me just how far they were willing to go. Mom, I've been thinking about your behavior lately and I'm genuinely concerned about your mental health. Marcus and Anthony agree that you might be having some kind of breakdown. We think you should see Dr. Peterson for an evaluation. If you don't respond to this message, we're going to have to consider more serious intervention. More serious intervention. They were threatening to have me declared mentally incompetent because I'd stopped financing their convenience. I showed the message to Margaret, who read it twice before speaking. Lucy, they're not going to stop. This isn't going to get easier from here. They're going to keep escalating until you either give in or cut them off completely. What do you mean, cut them off completely? I mean exactly what it sounds like. No contact. No responses to calls or messages. No explanations or justifications. Complete radio silence until they learn to treat you with respect. The idea terrified me. These were my children, the people I'd dedicated my life to raising and supporting. The thought of cutting off all contact felt like emotional amputation. But as I sat there thinking about Rebecca's threat to question my mental competency, about Marcus's assumption that I owed him an immediate response to his demands, about Anthony's entitled expectation that I would continue funding his artistic pursuits indefinitely, I realized that what I'd been calling love might actually have been fear. Fear of their disapproval, fear of their rejection, fear of being seen as a bad mother. What if they never come around? What if I lose them forever? Margaret reached over and took my hand. Honey, what exactly would you be losing? Relationships where you're valued only for what you provide? Children who threaten your mental competency when you stop enabling their selfishness? Is that really what you want to fight to preserve? That night, I lay in Margaret's guest bed, thinking about the woman I'd been before I became a mother. She'd been confident, ambitious, creative. She'd had opinions and dreams and boundaries. She'd mattered to herself as much as other people mattered to her. Somewhere along the way, I'd convinced myself that good mothers sacrifice everything for their children's happiness. I'd believed that putting my own needs first, even occasionally, was selfish and wrong. I'd taught my children that my time, money, and emotional energy were unlimited resources they could access without consideration or gratitude. No wonder they were confused by my sudden unavailability. I'd trained them to see me as a function rather than a person. The next morning, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. I blocked all 3 of my children's phone numbers. The silence that followed was immediate and profound. No more constant buzzing from my phone. No more guilt-inducing messages designed to manipulate me back into compliance. No more emotional whiplash from their alternating anger and fake concern. For the first time in 40 years, my thoughts were entirely my own. Margaret found me sitting on the back porch an hour later, staring at my phone with a mixture of relief and terror. "How does it feel?" she asked. "Like I just jumped off a cliff without checking if there was water below." "Good. That means you're finally taking a real risk instead of just playing it safe to avoid conflict." That afternoon, Margaret drove me to Sunrise Studios for my initial consultation with Diana Chen. The drive through mountain roads was spectacular, winding through forests that were just beginning to show their winter colors. I found myself really seeing the landscape instead of just enduring the journey, another small sign of how fundamentally my perspective was shifting. Sunrise Studios was housed in a converted barn surrounded by smaller outbuildings, each dedicated to different artistic disciplines. The main space was flooded with natural light from enormous windows, and the walls were covered with work created by previous residents. Paintings that ranged from carefully realistic to wildly abstract, pottery that showed both technical skill and playful experimentation, photography that captured moments of pure beauty or startling insight. Diana Chen was a small woman in her early 50s, with paint-stained fingers and the kind of calm presence that immediately put me at ease. She listened as I explained my situation, my recent awakening to the need for change, my complete lack of artistic experience but growing desire to create something meaningful. "Lucille, can I ask you something? When you imagine yourself creating art, what scares you most?" I thought about the question seriously. That I'll be terrible at it. That I'll waste time on something I have no talent for. That I'll discover I'm too old to learn something new. Diana smiled. All perfectly reasonable fears, and all completely irrelevant to the actual experience of creating. The women who get the most out of our program are the ones who come here not to become artists, but to remember what it feels like to play. I'm not sure I remember how to play. Then that's exactly what we'll work on. Would you like to see some of the studios? She led me through the pottery studio, where several women were working at wheels, their hands covered in clay and their faces completely absorbed in the process. None of them looked like professional artists, but all of them looked utterly content. In the painting studio, an elderly woman was working on a canvas covered in bold strokes of color that seemed to dance with energy and joy. When she noticed us watching, she grinned and waved a brush-covered hand. "That's Martha," Diana said quietly. "She's 78 and started painting for the first time last year after her husband died. She says it's the first thing she's ever done purely for herself." The jewelry studio was filled with women working with metals and stones, creating pieces that ranged from delicate and traditional to bold and contemporary. The fiber art studio showcased weaving, knitting, and embroidery projects that transformed practical skills into artistic expression. But it was the writing studio that called to me most strongly. A quiet room with comfortable chairs and large windows overlooking the mountains, where several women sat with notebooks or laptops, lost in their own thoughts and stories. "I used to write," I told Diana. "In nursing school, I loved my English classes. I even thought about majoring in journalism before I decided healthcare was more practical. What would you like to write about now?" "I don't know. Maybe about what it's like to discover you've been living someone else's life for 40 years. Maybe about learning to value yourself as much as you value everyone else." Diana nodded approvingly. "Sounds like you have plenty of material. Would you like to reserve a spot for January?" The cost was significant but not unreasonable, especially considering it included room, board, and all materials for a month of intensive creative exploration. More importantly, it felt like an investment in the woman I was becoming rather than a debt incurred for someone else's benefit. Yes, I said without hesitation. I'd like that very much. On the drive back to Margaret's house, I felt lighter than I had in years. For the first time since Black Friday, I was looking forward to something instead of dreading the next crisis or demand on my time and resources. How do you feel about your decision? Margaret asked. Terrified and excited in equal measure. Is that normal? Honey, that's the feeling of being alive instead of just existing. You're gonna love it. That evening, we celebrated my enrollment at Sunrise Studios with dinner at Margaret's favorite restaurant, a small Italian place run by a family who'd emigrated from Tuscany 20 years earlier. The food was incredible, but more importantly, it gave me a taste of what awaited me on my trip to Italy. Tell me about your Italian tour, Margaret said over dessert. I pulled out the itinerary I'd been carrying in my purse, spreading the pages across the table like treasure maps. 3 weeks, starting in Rome and ending in Venice. Art museums, cooking classes, small group tours of hill towns I can't pronounce. The best part is that it's designed for solo travelers, so I won't be the only person there figuring out how to vacation alone. When do you leave? February 15th. Right after I finish the art retreat. Margaret raised her wine glass. Here's to Lucille Cox, who's finally living like she deserves beautiful things. I clinked my glass against hers, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt like I was celebrating myself instead of someone else's achievements. Over the next few days, Margaret and I fell into a routine that felt both foreign and wonderful. Morning coffee on the porch, long walks through her neighborhood, afternoons spent reading or working on small art projects, evenings cooking together and talking about everything except my children's absence from my life. It was Margaret who first noticed the car. Lucy, is that Marcus's BMW parked across the street? I looked through the living room window and felt my stomach drop. Marcus's sleek black car was indeed parked at the curb, and I could see him sitting in the driver's seat, apparently waiting for something. How did he find me here? Probably called every hotel in the area until someone told him they hadn't seen you, then started checking with family. Or he could have hired a private investigator. People get very creative when their free labor suddenly becomes unavailable. As we watched, Marcus got out of the car and walked purposefully toward Margaret's front door. He was dressed in his expensive work clothes and carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation or persistence. The doorbell rang 3 times in rapid succession, followed by heavy knocking. Mrs. Whitman? This is Marcus Cox, Lucy's son. I know she's here. We need to talk. Margaret and I looked at each other. She raised an eyebrow in a silent question, and I shook my head. I wasn't ready for this confrontation, especially not on Margaret's territory. Should I answer? Margaret whispered. No, let him ring. Marcus continued knocking for several minutes, then returned to his car. But instead of leaving, he parked again and settled in to wait. He's gonna wait us out, I said. Let him. This is my house, Lucy. He has no right to demand entry or demand that I produce you on command. But Marcus's presence changed everything. The peaceful bubble Margaret and I had created was suddenly invaded by the reality of the situation I was trying to escape. My phone, which I'd left uncharged and silent for 2 days, suddenly felt like a ticking bomb. After an hour, Marcus got out of the car again and approached the house. This time, instead of ringing the doorbell, he walked around to the backyard and peered through windows, trying to catch a glimpse of movement inside. That's trespassing, Margaret said grimly. Should I call the police? The idea of involving law enforcement in a family dispute felt extreme. But Marcus's behavior was becoming increasingly aggressive. He'd driven 4 hours to track me down, and now he was literally prowling around someone else's property trying to force a confrontation I'd made clear I didn't want. Give me a minute to think. But Marcus didn't give me a minute. He returned to the front door and began pounding with his fist, hard enough that the sound echoed through the house. Mom, I know you're in there. We need to talk about this situation. You can't just disappear and expect everyone to pretend it's normal. Normal. There was that word again, used as a weapon to shame me back into compliance with expectations I'd never agreed to meet. Margaret stood up decisively. I'm not letting him terrorize us in my own home. She walked to the front door and spoke through it clearly and firmly. Marcus, This is Margaret Whitman. You are trespassing on my property and disturbing my neighbors. I'm asking you to leave immediately. Mrs. Whitman, I'm sorry, but I need to speak with my mother. There's been a misunderstanding, and we need to resolve it. There's been no misunderstanding. Your mother is an adult who chose to visit her sister. She doesn't owe you an explanation for her whereabouts or her decisions. She's not acting like herself. We're concerned about her mental state. I felt anger flare in my chest at hearing him question my mental competency to a woman he'd never bothered to get to know, despite 20 years of family gatherings where he'd treated Margaret with polite disinterest. Her mental state seems perfectly clear to me, Margaret replied coolly. She's finally started prioritizing her own well-being instead of enabling other people's selfishness. There was a long silence from the other side of the door. Mrs. Whitman, with all due respect, this is a family matter. And with all due respect, Marcus, your mother is my family too. And unlike you, I don't use guilt and manipulation to control her behavior. Another silence, longer this time. I'm not leaving until I talk to her. Margaret looked at me questioningly. I realized that avoiding this confrontation indefinitely wasn't possible. Marcus had shown he was willing to escalate his tactics, and I couldn't hide at my sister's house forever. I walked to the door and spoke for the first time. Marcus, I'll speak with you, but not here. Meet me at the coffee shop on Main Street in 30 minutes. Come alone and don't bring your lectures or ultimatums. If you want a conversation, we'll have a conversation. If you want to continue treating me like a malfunctioning appliance, you can drive home without speaking to me at all. Mom, finally, we really need to. 30 minutes, Marcus. Coffee shop on Main Street. Those are the terms. I heard his footsteps retreating, and a few minutes later, the sound of his car starting. Margaret looked at me with concern and admiration. Are you sure about this? No, but I can't keep running forever. And maybe it's time I found out if any of my children are capable of treating me like a person instead of a possession. I spent the next 20 minutes preparing for what I suspected would be one of the most difficult conversations of my life. I was about to discover whether the little boy I'd raised with so much love had grown into a man capable of respecting the woman who'd sacrificed everything to give him opportunities he now took for granted. The walk to the coffee shop felt like walking to my own trial, but for the first time in years, I knew I was walking toward the truth instead of away from it. The coffee shop on Main Street was busy with the afternoon crowd, filled with college students studying for finals and retirees enjoying leisurely conversations over steaming mugs. I chose a table near the back corner where we could speak privately without being overheard, and ordered a latte that I didn't particularly want but gave my hands something to do. Marcus arrived exactly 30 minutes after our conversation at Margaret's front door, and I could see the tension in his shoulders as he scanned the room looking for me. When our eyes met, his expression was a mixture of relief and barely controlled frustration. He ordered black coffee and approached my table with the measured steps of someone preparing for battle. Mom, he said, settling into the chair across from me. Thank you for agreeing to meet. I said I'd talk to you, Marcus. That doesn't mean I'm agreeing to anything else. He pulled out his phone and placed it on the table between us. Do you mind if I record this conversation? Rebecca and Anthony want to hear what you have to say, and I want to make sure I relay everything accurately. The request was so presumptuous that I almost laughed. He wanted to record our private conversation so he could share it with his siblings, as if I were a defendant whose testimony needed to be analyzed for weaknesses. Absolutely not. Put the phone away. Mom, we're just trying to understand. Put it away, Marcus, or this conversation is over before it starts. He reluctantly slipped the phone into his pocket, but I could see his jaw tighten with annoyance. He was accustomed to controlling the terms of our interactions, and my refusal to accommodate his demands was clearly frustrating him. Okay, fine. Mom, we need to talk about what's been happening these past few weeks. Your behavior has been completely out of character, and frankly, we're worried about you. What specifically about my behavior concerns you? Where do I start? You disappeared without telling anyone where you were going. You've been ignoring our calls and messages. You returned Christmas gifts that we were counting on. You're acting like we're strangers instead of your family. I sipped my latte and studied his face. Marcus had always been my most conventionally successful child, the one who wore expensive suits and drove luxury cars and lived in the kind of apartment featured in lifestyle magazines. But sitting across from him now, I could see past the polished exterior to the petulant expression of a child who wasn't getting his way. Marcus, when you say I disappeared without telling anyone, who exactly should I have informed of my travel plans? Well, us. Your family. We had arrangements to coordinate, plans that depended on your participation. Plans that I never agreed to participate in. Arrangements that assumed my time and money were available for your convenience without any consultation with me about whether those assumptions were accurate. That's not how it was. Then tell me how it was. Walk me through your decision-making process when you called and asked me to handle your Christmas shopping. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. We were busy with work. We thought you enjoyed doing that kind of thing. Did you ask if I enjoyed it? Or did you assume I enjoyed it because I've never complained about it? I don't see the difference. The difference, Marcus, is between someone who chooses to help because they want to and someone who helps because they feel obligated. I've spent 40 years helping all of you because I thought that's what good mothers do. I never stopped to consider whether you appreciated the help or just expected it. Of course we appreciate it. We've always appreciated everything you do for us. How do you show that appreciation? Another uncomfortable shift. We tell you thank you. We include you in family activities. When was the last time you invited me to a family activity that didn't involve me providing some kind of service? When was the last time you called just to see how I was doing? When was the last time you offered to help me with anything? Marcus stared at his coffee cup for a long moment. Mom, this isn't fair. You're making it sound like we only care about what you can do for us. Aren't you? Marcus, in the past year, every single conversation we've had has involved you asking me for something. Money, babysitting, Christmas shopping, emergency childcare, loan co-signing. When have we ever just talked about my life, my interests, my concerns? We talk about your life. No, you talk about how my life affects yours. You ask about my health when you need me to be available for something. You ask about my finances when you need money. You ask about my schedule when you need help. But when did you last ask about my dreams, my goals, my happiness? I could see him searching his memory and coming up empty. The silence stretched between us, filled with the background chatter of other cafe patrons and the hiss of the espresso machine. Mom, you're our mother. Taking care of your children is what mothers do. Taking care of children is what mothers do, Marcus. You're 38 years old. You have a successful career, a serious relationship, and a six-figure income. In what universe do you still qualify as a child who needs taking care of? I don't mean it like that. I mean we're family. Family helps each other. You keep saying that, but I haven't seen much evidence of this mutual help you're describing. When have you helped me? When have any of you offered to contribute to my well-being, instead of just expecting me to contribute to yours? Marcus's face was reddening with frustration. This is ridiculous. You're acting like we're terrible people because we asked you to help with Christmas shopping. I'm not acting like anything, Marcus. I'm stating facts. You asked me to do your Christmas shopping. You didn't show up to help. You didn't offer to reimburse me for the purchases. You didn't thank me for spending 6 hours in crowded stores buying gifts you would take credit for giving. And when I needed help carrying the bags to my car, every single one of you was too busy to spend 30 minutes helping your mother. We had other commitments. And I didn't? Marcus, do you have any idea what my commitments are? Do you know how I spend my time when I'm not solving your problems? He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The answer was obvious. He had no idea how I spent my time because he'd never bothered to ask. I'm retired, I continued. I have hobbies and interests and friends. I have books I want to read and places I want to see. I have dreams that have nothing to do with making your life more convenient. But you've never asked about any of that because you only see me as a function, not as a person. That's not true. Then tell me one thing I'm passionate about that has nothing to do with you or your siblings. Another long silence. Marcus stared at his hands, and I could see the exact moment when he realized he couldn't answer the question. I don't know, he admitted quietly. That's right. You don't know. And the reason you don't know is because you've never cared enough to ask. Marcus looked up at me then, and for just a moment I saw a flicker of the little boy he'd once been. Confused, hurt, struggling to understand why the world wasn't working the way he expected it to. Mom, I don't understand what you want from us. I want you to see me as a person instead of a service provider. I want you to value my time and money the way you value your own. I want you to consider my feelings and preferences when you make plans that involve me. I want you to offer to help me occasionally instead of constantly asking me to help you. But we do value you. You value what I do for you. There's a difference. Marcus ran his hand through his hair, a gesture that reminded me of all the times I'd comforted him as a child when he was overwhelmed or confused. But I wasn't his mother in that moment. I was a woman defending her right to be treated with respect. What do you want us to do differently? It was the first question he'd ask that suggested he might be willing to listen instead of just arguing. I want you to stop assuming I'm available whenever you need something. I want you to ask instead of demand. I want you to accept no as an answer without guilt trips or manipulation. I want you to contribute to family celebrations instead of expecting me to finance and organize everything. I want you to show interest in my life that doesn't revolve around how I can serve yours. And if we do those things, you'll go back to normal? Normal. There was that word again, the weapon they used to shame me back into compliance. Marcus, I am not going back to the way things were. The woman who enabled your selfishness and subsidized your convenience is gone. I'm not becoming someone different. I'm becoming who I always was underneath all the people-pleasing and guilt. So you're just going to cut us out of your life? I'm going to have the kind of relationship with you that you've shown me you're capable of having. If you can learn to treat me with respect, we can have a respectful relationship. If you can only relate to me as a resource to be exploited, then we can't have a relationship at all. Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying my face as if seeing me for the first time. You're serious about this? Completely serious. What about Christmas? What about the grandchildren? What about them? You're all adults capable of planning your own holiday celebrations. Emma and Jake have parents who can provide them with a wonderful Christmas without relying on their grandmother to finance and organize everything. But you always handle Christmas. I always handled Christmas because you let me. Because it was easier for all of you to let me do the work while you enjoyed the results. But I'm done being your unpaid event coordinator. Marcus pulled out his wallet and placed a $20 bill on the table, more than enough to cover both our drinks. It was a small gesture, but the first time in our conversation that he'd taken responsibility for anything. Mom, I need to think about this. This is a lot to process. Take all the time you need. But Marcus, understand that I'm not waiting for your permission to live my life differently. I'm not asking for your approval or your understanding. I'm informing you of how things are going to be from now on. He stood up slowly, looking older than when he'd sat down. What should I tell Rebecca and Anthony? Tell them whatever you want. Or better yet, suggest they call me themselves if they want to have an actual conversation, instead of sending you as their representative. You blocked our numbers. I blocked your numbers because you were using them to harass and manipulate me. If you want to communicate with me, you can write letters like adults did for centuries before cell phones existed. Marcus walked toward the door, then turned back. Mom, I hope you know we love you. I hope someday you'll know what love actually looks like, Marcus, because what you've been showing me isn't love. It's dependency disguised as affection. After he left, I sat in the coffee shop for another hour, processing the conversation and its implications. Marcus had listened, which was more than I'd expected. He'd admitted, however reluctantly, that he didn't know me as a person beyond my function in his life. But I could see that his primary concern was still how my changes would affect his convenience, rather than how his behavior had affected my well-being. It was a start, but barely one. When I returned to Margaret's house, she was waiting on the front porch with a glass of wine and a concerned expression. How did it go? Better than I expected, worse than I hoped. I told her about the conversation, about Marcus's reluctant admissions, and continued focus on his own inconvenience. Margaret listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally when I described particularly revealing moments. Do you think he'll change? She asked when I finished. I think he'll try to find ways to get what he wants from me, without having to examine his own behavior too closely. He might become more polite about his demands, but I don't think he's ready to see me as an equal, rather than a resource. And how do you feel about that? Sad, but not surprised. Margaret, I spent 40 years teaching my children that my needs didn't matter as much as theirs. I can't expect them to unlearn that lesson in a single conversation. What's your plan now? I'm going to live my life. I'm going to take the art classes, go on the Italian trip, pursue my own interests, and see if any of them decide they'd rather have a relationship with me than continue trying to control me. Over the next few days, Margaret and I settled back into our peaceful routine. Marcus didn't return, though I suspected he was reporting back to his siblings about our conversation. I didn't hear from Rebecca or Anthony directly, but I wasn't expecting to. They'd always been more comfortable sending Marcus to handle difficult family negotiations. A week before Christmas, I received a letter. Not an email or a text, but an actual handwritten letter delivered by the postal service. The return address showed Rebecca's name and address, written in the careful cursive I remembered from her childhood thank you notes. I opened it at Margaret's kitchen table while she made coffee, curious about what Rebecca had chosen to say when forced to communicate like a civilized adult, rather than through demands and guilt trips. The letter was 3 pages long, handwritten on expensive stationery. Rebecca had always been the most articulate of my children, and she'd clearly put considerable thought into her words. Dear Mom, it began. Marcus told us about your conversation at the coffee shop. I've been thinking about what he said, and I want you to know that I never intended to make you feel unappreciated or taken for granted. I read the letter aloud to Margaret, who listened with growing skepticism as Rebecca described her busy schedule, her overwhelming responsibilities as a working mother, and her assumption that I enjoyed being needed by my family. She's still making excuses, Margaret observed when I reached the second page. The letter continued with Rebecca's version of our family dynamics, painting herself as a stressed daughter, trying to balance work and motherhood while relying on her mother's support. She acknowledged that perhaps they'd asked too much of me lately, but suggested that the solution was better communication rather than the dramatic changes I was making. I don't understand why you felt you had to disappear instead of just telling us you were feeling overwhelmed, she wrote. We could have worked something out. We're family, and families should be able to talk through problems together. The final page was the most revealing. Rebecca detailed the impact my absence was having on Emma and Jake, who were confused about why Grandma Lucy had suddenly become unavailable. She described their disappointment about Christmas plans being disrupted and their concern that they'd done something to upset me. The children miss you, she concluded. And, honestly, so do I. I hope you'll reconsider your decision to distance yourself from us during the holidays. Whatever problems we need to work out, surely we can do that while still maintaining our family traditions. I set the letter down and looked at Margaret, who was shaking her head slowly. She completely missed the point, Margaret said. She's still trying to negotiate terms for your surrender, instead of acknowledging that she needs to change her behavior. She mentioned the grandchildren in every paragraph, using them as emotional leverage. Classic manipulation. When reason fails, use the children. I read the letter again, looking for any acknowledgement of responsibility, any genuine apology, any indication that Rebecca understood why I'd made the changes I'd made. But the entire letter was focused on minimizing her behavior and maximizing my overreaction to it. She wants me to come back for Christmas, I said. Of course she does. Christmas is in 5 days, and she hasn't figured out how to handle it without her personal event coordinator. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in its envelope. I need to respond to this. Do you want to call her? Number. If she can write letters, so can I. I spent the afternoon crafting my response, writing and rewriting until I'd found the right balance of firmness and clarity. The final version was shorter than Rebecca's letter, but more direct. Dear Rebecca, I wrote. Thank you for your letter. I appreciate that you took the time to write rather than sending demanding messages. However, I noticed that your letter focuses entirely on how my decisions affect you and the children, with no acknowledgement of how your behavior has affected me. You describe feeling overwhelmed and needing support, but you don't acknowledge that I might also feel overwhelmed by constantly being expected to solve everyone else's problems. You say you never intended to make me feel unappreciated, but impact matters more than intention. The fact that you didn't mean to take advantage of my generosity doesn't change the fact that you did take advantage of it. You suggest that better communication could have prevented this situation, but I tried to communicate my needs for years. When I was tired, you told me to rest later. When I was stressed about money, you assured me you'd pay me back someday. When I needed help, you were always too busy to provide it. I am not distancing myself from the family to punish you. I am creating boundaries to protect myself. Those boundaries will remain in place until I see genuine changes in how I'm treated, rather than just promises of better communication. I love Emma and Jake, and I'm sorry they're confused by the changes in our family dynamic. But I won't be guilted into returning to an unhealthy situation, because explaining healthy boundaries to children is inconvenient for their parents. I hope you all have a wonderful Christmas. When you're ready to treat me as a person deserving of respect, rather than a resource to be managed, I'll be here. Love, Mom. I mailed the letter the next day and felt a profound sense of closure. I'd said what needed to be said without anger or accusation, simply stating the facts and my position clearly. Christmas Eve arrived gray and cold, with the kind of weather that made staying inside with hot chocolate and good books feel like the perfect plan. Margaret and I had created our own quiet celebration, decorating a small tree with ornaments she'd collected over the years, and planning a simple dinner that we could enjoy without stress or obligations. Any regrets? Margaret asked as we sat by the tree with our morning coffee. About what? Missing Christmas with the children. I thought about Emma and Jake opening presents that Rebecca had actually shopped for herself, about Marcus and Sarah hosting dinner without relying on my cooking and planning, about Anthony learning to navigate the holidays without financial support from me. No regrets, I said honestly. This is the first Christmas in 40 years that I'm spending exactly the way I want to spend it. What do you want to do today? I want to finish the scarf I'm knitting for you. I want to read the book I started yesterday. I want to cook dinner with you without worrying about whether everyone will like what we're making. I want to have the kind of Christmas that feels peaceful instead of performative. We spent the day doing exactly that. I finished Margaret's scarf, a simple pattern in soft blue wool that had taken me 3 weeks to complete. She gave me a beautiful journal bound in leather, perfect for the writing I planned to do at Sunrise Studios. For your new stories, she said when I opened it. The ones where you're the protagonist instead of the supporting character. That evening we cooked dinner together, laughing at Margaret's attempts to teach me her grandmother's bread recipe and my complete inability to roll pasta dough thin enough to meet her standards. It was chaotic and imperfect and absolutely wonderful. As we sat down to eat, Margaret raised her wine glass to Lucille Cox, who finally figured out that she deserves to be the main character in her own life. To Margaret Whitman, who never let me forget that I was worth more than I was accepting. We clinked glasses, and I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't experienced in decades. Peace. Complete, uncompromising peace with my choices and my life. My phone, which I'd recharged but left on silent, showed 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. I glanced at the screen and turned it face down without reading any of them. Aren't you curious? Margaret asked. Not even a little bit. Whatever crisis they think requires my immediate attention will either resolve itself or teach them something about solving their own problems. The next morning brought a surprise. A knock at Margaret's door revealed a delivery driver with an enormous bouquet of flowers and an envelope addressed to me in Anthony's handwriting. The flowers were beautiful, clearly expensive, and completely unnecessary. The card attached read, "Mom, we miss you. Love, Marcus, Rebecca, and Anthony." I opened Anthony's letter while Margaret arranged the flowers in a vase. His handwriting was less careful than Rebecca's, more hurried, as if he'd written it in a burst of emotion rather than careful consideration. "Mom, I don't understand what happened, but I know I messed up somehow. Marcus told me about your conversation, and Rebecca shared your letter with us. I've been thinking about what you said about only calling when I need something, and I realized you're right. I can't remember the last time I called just to talk to you. I'm sorry. I don't know what else to say except I'm sorry and I want to do better. I know I've been irresponsible with money, and I know I've taken advantage of your generosity. I always told myself I'd pay you back when I got successful, but I never really tried that hard to get successful, because I knew you'd always be there to help. I don't want to lose you, Mom. I know I don't deserve another chance, but if you're willing to give me one, I promise I'll do better. I won't ask for money anymore. I won't make assumptions about your time. I'll try to be the kind of son you deserve, instead of the kind of son I've been. I love you. Not because of what you do for me, but because you're my mom and you've always believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself. Please don't give up on me completely. Love, Anthony. I read the letter twice, then handed it to Margaret. She read it silently, then looked up at me with surprise. This is different from the others. He actually apologized. Not for getting caught or for the consequences of his behavior, but for the behavior itself. Do you believe him? I want to. But Anthony has always been good with words when he needs something. The question is whether he's capable of following through on his promises. What are you going to do? I'm going to finish my coffee and decide later. One sincere letter doesn't undo years of entitled behavior, but it's the first sign that any of my children might be capable of growth. Over the next few days, I thought about Anthony's letter and what response, if any, it deserved. Unlike Rebecca's defensive justifications or Marcus's attempts to negotiate a return to the status quo, Anthony had acknowledged his behavior and taken responsibility for it. But I'd heard apologies from Anthony before. He'd promised to be more responsible with money after I'd co-signed his last loan. He'd sworn he'd pay me back promptly after I'd covered his rent the previous spring. He'd assured me he was finally ready to stand on his own feet after countless requests for financial support. The difference this time was that he wasn't asking for anything. No requests for money, no pleas for help, no suggestions that his apology should be rewarded with resumed assistance. Just acknowledgement of his behavior and a promise to do better. 3 days after Christmas, I wrote him back. Dear Anthony, thank you for your letter and for the beautiful flowers. I appreciate that you took responsibility for your behavior rather than making excuses for it. You're right that you've taken advantage of my generosity, and you're right that I've enabled that behavior by continuing to help without expecting accountability. We've both contributed to an unhealthy dynamic that needs to change. I accept your apology, but I want you to understand that apologies without changed behavior are meaningless. If you want to rebuild our relationship, you'll need to show me through your actions that you see me as a person worthy of respect, rather than a resource to be exploited when convenient. I won't be providing financial support anymore, regardless of the circumstances. I won't be available for last-minute emergencies that result from poor planning. I won't be assuming responsibility for your problems or their solutions. But if you genuinely want to know me as a person rather than just as your mother, I'm open to exploring what that kind of relationship might look like. I love you too, Anthony. I always have. I hope you'll use this opportunity to become the man I've always believed you could be. Love, Mom. I mailed the letter on New Year's Eve, feeling like I was sending more than just words into the world. I was sending a final chance for at least one of my children to prove that our relationship could be based on mutual respect rather than one-sided exploitation. New Year's Day dawned bright and clear, perfect weather for new beginnings. Margaret and I spent the morning walking through the snow-covered mountains behind her house, talking about the year ahead and the changes we both wanted to make. I've been thinking about selling this house, Margaret said as we paused to rest on a fallen log overlooking the valley below. Really? Why? It's too big for just me, and the maintenance is getting expensive. I've been looking at those senior communities that offer independent living with optional services. Not nursing homes, but places where I could have my own space while being part of a larger community. That sounds wonderful. Are you thinking of staying in this area? Actually, I've been researching communities near Sunrise Studios. There's a beautiful development about 20 minutes from the art colony, designed specifically for creative retirees. They have workshops, visiting artists, even partnerships with local galleries for residents who want to show their work. I looked at my sister with growing excitement. Are you seriously considering moving near where I'll be taking classes? I've been seriously considering it since you told me about your transformation. Lucy, watching you finally stand up for yourself has inspired me to make some changes of my own. I've been playing it safe for too long, staying in this house because it's familiar, maintaining routines because they're comfortable. But comfortable isn't the same as fulfilling. What would you do in a new community? I'd take art classes seriously instead of just dabbling. I'd travel more, maybe join one of those groups that does cultural tours for seniors. I'd stop telling myself I'm too old to try new things and start acting like I'm young enough to enjoy whatever time I have left. We sat in comfortable silence, both of us contemplating the possibilities that stretched ahead. For the first time in my adult life, I was making plans based entirely on what I wanted, rather than what other people needed from me. Margaret, can I ask you something? Do you think I'm being too hard on my children? She considered the question seriously before answering. Lucy, you spent 40 years being too easy on them. They learned to see you as inexhaustibly available, infinitely generous, and completely without needs of your own. That wasn't healthy for any of you. But what if they never come around? What if I lose them completely? Then you'll have lost relationships that were built on exploitation rather than love. And you'll have gained something much more valuable, a life lived on your own terms. I never thought of it that way. Honey, you raised 3 adults who are perfectly capable of taking care of themselves. The fact that they chose not to, while you were willing to do it for them, doesn't mean they can't learn. It just means they've never had to. And if they can't learn, then that's their loss, not yours. You've given them everything they need to succeed in life. What they do with those tools is up to them. As we walked back to the house, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with my children's approval or disapproval. I'd spent decades measuring my worth by how much I could give and how little I needed in return. Now I was learning to value myself based on my own assessment of who I wanted to be. The woman walking down that mountain path was not the same woman who'd been abandoned at North Shore Shopping Center 6 weeks earlier. She was stronger, clearer, more honest about her own worth. She had plans that excited her, boundaries that protected her, and the kind of peace that comes from finally aligning your actions with your values. In 2 weeks, I would start the art retreat that would teach me to create beauty for its own sake. In 6 weeks, I would begin a journey through Italy that would show me parts of the world I'd only dreamed of seeing. In the months and years ahead, I would continue building a life that reflected my own choices rather than everyone else's expectations. My children might or might not choose to be part of that life, but either way, it would be a life worth living. For the first time in 40 years, I was certain of that. The morning I left for Sunrise Studios, Margaret helped me load my car with art supplies, journals, and enough clothes for a month of creative exploration. The January air was crisp and full of possibility, and I felt like I was embarking on the most important journey of my life. Call me when you get settled, Margaret said, embracing me tightly. I want to hear about everything. I will. And Maggie? Thank you for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself. That's what sisters are for, Lucy. Now go create something beautiful. The drive to Sunrise Studios took me through mountain roads that wound past snow-covered pine forests and frozen streams. Each mile felt like another step away from the woman I'd been and toward the woman I was becoming. I'd left my phone in the glove compartment, determined to start this experience without the constant possibility of interruption from people who still saw me as their personal problem solver. Diana Chen welcomed me at the main building with the same calm warmth I remembered from my initial visit. She introduced me to the other women beginning the January intensive, a diverse group ranging in age from 45 to 78, each carrying her own story of transformation and discovery. There was Maria, a 60-year-old former corporate executive who'd taken early retirement after realizing she'd spent 30 years building someone else's dreams instead of her own. Susan, a 52-year-old divorced mother whose children had left for college, leaving her to rediscover who she was beyond her role as caregiver. Patricia, a 73-year-old widow who'd decided that grief didn't have to mean the end of joy. Each woman had reached a point in her life where she'd decided to prioritize her own growth and creativity, often for the first time in decades. Listening to their stories over dinner that first night, I realized I wasn't alone in my journey towards self-discovery. The thing about women our age, Patricia said as we sat around the fireplace after dinner, is that we've spent so many years being what other people needed that we've forgotten what we actually want. This place gives us permission to remember. My first week at Sunrise Studios was a revelation in creative possibility. I tried everything offered, from watercolor painting to pottery, from creative writing to jewelry making. Some activities spoke to me immediately, others felt awkward and foreign, but all of them taught me something about the pleasure of creating without judgment. It was in the writing workshop that I found my strongest voice. Led by a gentle woman named Dr. Sarah Mitchell, The sessions focused on memoir and personal narrative, encouraging us to explore our own stories with honesty and compassion. Your life is your material, Dr. Mitchell told us during our first session. Every experience you've had, every relationship you've navigated, every challenge you've overcome is rich with meaning and insight. The question isn't whether your story is worth telling. The question is whether you're brave enough to tell it truthfully. I began writing about my transformation, starting with that morning at North Shore Shopping Center, when everything changed. The words flowed onto paper like water that had been held back by a dam for 40 years. I wrote about the years of enabling and people-pleasing, about the gradual erosion of my sense of self, about the moment I realized I'd been living everyone else's life instead of my own. But I also wrote about the joy of rediscovering my own worth, about the liberation of setting boundaries, about the peace that came from finally aligning my actions with my values. The story that emerged was not one of victimhood, but of empowerment. Not a tale of loss, but one of profound gain. Dr. Mitchell read my first piece aloud to the group, with my permission, and the response was immediate and powerful. Several women were moved to tears, not from sadness, but from recognition. They saw their own stories reflected in mine, their own struggles with self-worth and boundary setting mirrored in my journey. "Lucy," said Maria after the reading, "you've put words to something I've been feeling for years but couldn't articulate. The idea that we enable our own mistreatment by being too afraid of conflict to stand up for ourselves. I kept thinking I was being loving," I replied, "but what I was really being was afraid. Afraid they wouldn't love me if I wasn't constantly useful to them." "And now?" asked Susan. "Now I know that if someone only loves you for what you do for them, they don't actually love you at all." The writing workshop became the center of my daily routine at Sunrise Studios. Each morning I would wake early and spend an hour at my desk exploring different aspects of my story and my transformation. The words came easily now, as if years of silence had created a reservoir of thoughts and feelings that were finally being released. I wrote about the difference between being needed and being respected, about the ways women are conditioned to measure their worth by their usefulness to others, about the courage required to disappoint people who've grown accustomed to your compliance. I wrote about the fear of being seen as selfish and the revolutionary act of deciding that your own happiness matters as much as everyone else's. But I also explored my failures and regrets, the ways I'd contributed to the unhealthy family dynamics by never setting appropriate boundaries. I examined my role in teaching my children to see me as infinitely available and endlessly giving, and I took responsibility for the patterns I'd created through decades of enabling behavior. The hardest part, I wrote in one piece, wasn't realizing that my children were taking advantage of my generosity. The hardest part was accepting that I'd taught them to do it. 3 weeks into my stay at Sunrise Studios, I received a letter from Anthony. It was delivered to the main office, where Diana handed it to me with a knowing smile. "Personal mail always finds its way to the people who need it most," she said. I took the letter to my favorite spot, a sun-drenched corner of the writing studio that overlooked the mountains, and opened it carefully. Anthony's handwriting was more careful this time, less rushed, as if he'd taken time to consider each word. "Dear Mom," it began. "I hope this letter finds you well, and that you're enjoying your art classes. I wanted to let you know that I've been thinking about our last exchange, and about the changes I promised to make. I got a full-time job at a marketing company downtown. It's not creative work, but it pays well and has good benefits. I'm using my photography skills in their social media department, so it's not completely removed from my artistic interests. More importantly, it means I can support myself without relying on anyone else's generosity. I also wanted you to know that I paid Marcus back the money I borrowed from him last year, and I've started a payment plan to reimburse Rebecca for the times she covered my rent. I know these debts seem small compared to everything you've given me over the years, but I wanted to start somewhere. I've been seeing a counselor who specializes in family relationships and financial responsibility. She's helping me understand why I found it so easy to depend on you and so hard to depend on myself. I'm learning about boundaries and respect, and the difference between asking for help and taking advantage of someone's love. I don't know if you'll want to see me when you finish your retreat, but I hope you'll consider it. I'd like to take you to dinner somewhere nice, my treat, and just talk. Not about money or problems or what I need from you, but about your art classes and your plans for Italy and whatever else you'd like to share. I miss you, Mom. Not the version of you that solved my problems and paid my bills, but the actual you. The woman who used to read me stories and teach me to see beauty in ordinary things and believe in possibilities I was too scared to pursue on my own. I'm trying to become the kind of man who deserves to know that woman. Love, Anthony. I read the letter 3 times, then sat quietly looking out at the mountains while I processed what he'd written. This wasn't the Anthony I'd known for 32 years. The charming young man who made promises he never kept, and apologies that were really requests for renewed enabling. This was someone who was taking concrete action to change his behavior without asking for anything in return. That evening, during our group discussion time, I shared Anthony's letter with the other women in the writing workshop. They listened thoughtfully as I read it aloud, and their responses were varied and insightful. He's doing the work, said Patricia. Not just saying he'll do better, but actually making changes. The fact that he's paying back his siblings shows he understands that accountability has to be demonstrated, not just promised, added Maria. But the most important thing, said Dr. Mitchell, is how you feel about it. Does this letter feel manipulative to you, or does it feel genuine? I considered the question carefully. It feels genuine. For the first time in years, Anthony is telling me about his life without asking me to fix something or provide something. He's sharing his progress without expecting me to reward it. How do you want to respond? I want to write back. But I want to be clear that one letter and a few months of better behavior don't erase years of problematic patterns. I want to acknowledge his efforts while maintaining my boundaries. That sounds like wisdom, Dr. Mitchell said. You can appreciate someone's growth without rushing back into old dynamics. I spent the next day crafting my response to Anthony, writing and rewriting, until I found the right balance of encouragement and caution. Dear Anthony, I wrote, thank you for your letter and for sharing the positive changes you're making in your life. I'm proud of you for taking responsibility for your financial obligations and for seeking professional help to understand the patterns that led to our relationship becoming so unbalanced. Your job sounds like a good fit for your skills, and I'm glad you're finding ways to use your creativity in a sustainable career. The fact that you're prioritizing financial responsibility over immediate artistic gratification shows maturity that I haven't seen from you before. I appreciate your invitation to dinner when I return from Italy. I'd like that, with the understanding that we're building a new kind of relationship based on mutual respect rather than returning to old patterns. I'm interested in getting to know the man you're becoming, not just the son you've always been to me. I love you, Anthony, and I'm hopeful about the possibility of developing a healthier relationship between us. But I want you to understand that my willingness to try again is contingent on continued demonstration of the changes you've described, not just on the promises you've made. Keep up the good work. I'm proud of you for choosing growth over comfort. Love, Mom. The remainder of my time at Sunrise Studios was peaceful and productive. I completed several pieces of writing that I was genuinely proud of, including a long essay about the difference between selflessness and self-sacrifice that Dr. Mitchell encouraged me to submit for publication. I also discovered a talent for watercolor painting that surprised everyone, including myself. My landscapes were simple but evocative, capturing the play of light on mountain peaks and the subtle colors of winter forests. Diana suggested I consider continuing with painting classes when I returned from Italy, maybe even exploring opportunities to show my work locally. You have a natural eye for color and composition, she told me during one of our individual consultations. More importantly, you paint with genuine emotion. Technical skill can be learned, but authenticity can't be taught. On my final morning at Sunrise Studios, I packed my bags with mixed emotions. I was excited about the Italian adventure that awaited me, but sad to leave the community of women who'd become so important to my journey of self-discovery. This isn't goodbye, Patricia said as we exchanged contact information. This is just the beginning of staying connected, as we all continue growing into who we're meant to be. Promise me you'll keep writing. Drive, Mitchell said as she handed me a folder containing copies of all the pieces I'd completed during the retreat. Your voice is strong and clear now. Don't let it get buried again under other people's expectations. I drove away from Sunrise Studios feeling more complete than I had in years. The month of creative exploration had given me more than new skills and artistic confidence. It had confirmed that I was capable of living a life centered on my own interests and values, rather than everyone else's needs and demands. The drive to Margaret's house gave me time to process everything I'd experienced and learned during the retreat. I thought about the women I'd met, each of them brave enough to prioritize their own growth and happiness after decades of putting everyone else first. I thought about the writing I'd done, the stories I'd excavated from years of silence and self-neglect. I thought about the paintings I'd created, imperfect but honest expressions of beauty as I saw it. Most importantly, I thought about the person I'd become during those 4 weeks. Not someone different from who I'd always been, but someone who'd finally been given permission to exist fully and authentically. Margaret was waiting for me with dinner ready and wine chilled, eager to hear about every detail of my retreat experience. We talked late into the night, and I could see that my transformation was inspiring her own continued growth. "I put an offer on a condo in that retirement community I told you about," she announced over dessert. "It's beautiful, Lucy. 2 bedrooms, a studio space, and a view of the mountains. Best of all, it's only 15 minutes from Sunrise Studios." "Margaret, that's wonderful. When would you move?" "If everything goes smoothly, right around the time you get back from Italy. We could both be starting new chapters in the same area." The idea of having my sister nearby as I continued building my new life felt like an unexpected gift. We'd both spent too many years living for other people's convenience. Now we were choosing to live near each other for the simple pleasure of each other's company. 2 days before my departure for Italy, I received letters from both Marcus and Rebecca. They arrived on the same day, as if coordinated, though their contents couldn't have been more different. Marcus's letter was brief and businesslike, written in the tone he used for professional correspondence. He acknowledged that their behavior had been problematic and expressed interest in, quote, exploring more balanced family dynamics. But the language was cold and calculated, lacking any genuine emotion or personal insight. "I think we can work out an arrangement that meets everyone's needs," he concluded, as if my feelings were items to be negotiated rather than respected. Rebecca's letter was longer but equally manipulative. She spent 3 pages detailing Emma and Jake's confusion about my absence, their questions about why Grandma Lucy didn't love them anymore, their disappointment about missed birthday parties and school events. "I'm trying to explain to them that you're going through some kind of phase," she wrote, "but they're too young to understand why their grandmother suddenly decided she doesn't want to be part of their lives." The letter was designed to make me feel guilty for hurting innocent children, but it had the opposite effect. Rebecca was willing to confuse and upset her own children rather than explain that their grandmother had chosen to prioritize her own well-being. She preferred to paint me as unstable rather than acknowledge that her behavior had been problematic. I didn't respond to either letter. Instead, I finished packing for Italy and focused on the adventure ahead. The morning of my departure, Margaret drove me to the airport with tears in her eyes and excitement in her voice. 3 weeks in Italy, Lucy. Can you believe it? I'm still pinching myself. 6 months ago, I was doing everyone else's Christmas shopping while they slept in. Now I'm about to see the Sistine Chapel and take cooking classes in Tuscany. You've earned every minute of this trip. Enjoy every second. And don't you dare feel guilty about spending money on something that makes you happy. I won't. For the first time in my life, I'm completely confident that I deserve beautiful experiences. As my plane lifted off the runway, I looked down at the landscape below and felt a profound sense of freedom. For the next 3 weeks, I would be completely unreachable by anyone who might want to turn me back into their personal assistant. I would be Lucille Cox, world traveler, art enthusiast, and woman living entirely for her own pleasure and enrichment. Italy exceeded every expectation I'd dared to have. The art in Florence moved me to tears of recognition and wonder. The cooking classes in a Tuscan farmhouse taught me that creativity in the kitchen could be just as fulfilling as creativity on canvas. The small group of fellow travelers became fast friends, women and men who'd also decided that life was too short to spend it entirely in service to other people's agendas. I stood in the Sistine Chapel and understood what it meant to be in the presence of transcendent beauty. I walked through the ruins of ancient Rome and felt connected to centuries of human experience and achievement. I sat in a Venetian cafe watching gondoliers navigate the canals, and finally understood why people traveled for the simple pleasure of witnessing how other humans chose to live. On my final night in Italy, sitting on the balcony of my hotel room overlooking the Grand Canal, I wrote in my journal about the transformation that had brought me to this moment. 6 months ago, I thought happiness was selfish and self-care was self-indulgent. I believed that good women sacrificed their own dreams for everyone else's convenience. I measured my worth by how much I could give, and how little I needed in return. Now I know that I can't give authentically to others, unless I first honor my own needs and desires. I can't love genuinely from a place of resentment and depletion. I can't build healthy relationships with people who only value what I can provide rather than who I actually am. This trip has shown me that I'm capable of joy, wonder, curiosity, and growth. I'm not just someone's mother or sister or helper. I'm a complete person with my own interests, dreams, and capacity for adventure. Tomorrow, I fly home to a life that I've designed around my own values and priorities. Some of my children may choose to be part of that life, and others may not. Either way, it will be a life worth living because it's finally, authentically mine. The flight home gave me time to think about the life I was returning to and the choices that awaited me. Anthony had continued writing during my travels, sending letters to Margaret's house that she'd forwarded to me in Italy. His progress seemed genuine and sustained, not just a temporary effort to win back my financial support. Marcus and Rebecca had also written, but their letters continued to focus on their own inconvenience rather than any genuine reflection on their behavior. They wanted me to return to my old role as family coordinator and emergency resource, just with better communication and more appreciation. I knew now what my response would be to each of them. Anthony had earned the chance to rebuild our relationship on healthier terms. Marcus and Rebecca would need to demonstrate real change before I'd consider resuming any significant relationship with them. But even if none of my children chose to grow into relationships based on mutual respect, I would be fine. I had art to create, stories to write, travels to plan, and friendships to nurture. I had Margaret nearby and new adventures ahead. I had a life that reflected my own choices rather than everyone else's expectations. The woman who walked off that plane was not the same woman who'd been abandoned at a shopping mall 6 months earlier. She was stronger, clearer, more honest about her own worth. She had boundaries that protected her and dreams that excited her. She knew the difference between being loved and being used, and she would never again settle for the latter while believing it was the former. As I collected my luggage and headed toward the exit, I saw Margaret waiting for me with a huge smile and a welcome home sign that made me laugh out loud. "How does it feel to be back?" she asked as we drove toward her house. "Like coming home to a life that actually belongs to me," I said, and meant every word. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.